Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bill Lacey, the director of the Dole Institute. I want to welcome all of you. This is our fellow's last discussion group today. He has a fantastic guest. You're really going to enjoy hearing from her. But I'm going to let him introduce her. I do want to say that we thank you for coming out and for supporting this. When I decided to, when I talked to Jim first about doing a fellowship, and he expressed an interest in doing it on independent candidacies, and the possibility of third-party efforts. I thought it was fascinating, and it's turned out to be great. So I just want to thank Jim for a terrific semester. It's been great having you around. All of your discussion groups have exceeded expectations. And I just want to ask everybody to join me in thanking you for doing such a fantastic job here at the Dole Institute.
Thank you.
Without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Bill Lacey. And Bill, thank you to you and to your staff, which have just been phenomenal, to the Student Advisory Board and for their help on making this real honor and privilege for me to be a part of this. So thank you for doing that. And I'm thrilled that we get to cap this discussion group with my friend Jackie Salit, who's come all the way from New York City to join us today. And I'd like to introduce her, because I think you will really get a kick out of her and her experience in this space. Jacqueline Salit is a national, pardon me, I can't see anything, is a national advocate for independent voters who are now 44% of the American electorate and an agitator for eliminating the partisan bias in our system of elections and government. As president of Independent Voting, the Strategy and Organizing Center she co-founded in 1994 as the Perot Rebellion was gaining steam, she has become a champion of popular disalignment from the Democratic and Republican parties and a bridge builder among disparate elements of the independent movement. Salit played key campaign roles for an unexpected mix of independent candidates, from Ross Perot to Dr. Lenora Fulani to Michael Bloomberg. Her book, Independence Rising, was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2012. She's the author of the strategy paper, Finding Otherness, a blueprint for an independent conversation about 2020, and a contributor to the research paper, Game Changers, Independent Voters May Rewrite the Political Playbook, published in partnership with the Morrison Institute for Public Policy at Arizona State University and the USC Schwarzenegger Institute for State and Global Policy. She lives in New York City, where she is a playwright and is at work on a novel. Welcome, Jackie.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So independent voting, talk about this organization. This is really one of the more influential independent organizing groups in the country. How did you get it started, and what's your mission?
We got it started in 1994, and the context in the country at that time, of course, was that it was just a couple of years after the explosion, the political explosion that became known as the Perot Rebellion. And there was a climate in the country for the first time in quite a while that there might be some kind of subterranean, let's call it distress, with the two parties and with the traditional forms of policy making and governing and so on and so forth. And so we founded the organization largely to be a platform for two things. One, to try to make visible a new and emerging constituency in American political life, the independent voter. And two, to try to experiment with whether it was possible to bring people together across ideological boundaries, to try to build what you would call, left, center, right coalitions. Could you build them? How could you build them? Who would come to the table for that kind of thing? So that was the mission of the organization, and it's been kind of a wild ride since then, which perhaps we'll get into talking a little bit about. But that's what started the organization.
And have you found that there really are, contrary to what some political scientists will tell us, are there independent voters, or are they just leaners one way or the other and want to not join one of the two parties?
All right, well, this is one of my favorite topics, as you know. yes, there is such a thing as an independent voter, and as you said in your introduction here, the latest Gallup poll puts the number at about 40%. And Gallup, by the way, is now tracking this number every month. So just at the surface level, I think it's unlikely that an organization like Gallup would be tracking a non-existent phenomenon on a monthly basis. But part of what you're referring to, and this is a really important issue, and I'm so glad we're actually talking about it here at the Institute of Politics, is there's the traditional political science categories say that there's really no such thing as an independent voter. That people might call themselves independents, but when it comes down to it, when it's election day, they, generally speaking, either vote for a Democrat or a Republican. There's a slight problem with that analysis, for starters. For one thing, usually that's all there is to vote for on election day. So I don't know that you can deduce from that it's not meaningful to people that they've decided to call themselves independents. I also think that in the rise of the independent voter in contemporary political life is not simply about who people vote for.
Mm-hmm.
That's an indicator of certain kinds of things, largely I think what's available to them, and then a choice that they make given the choices that are available, right? But I think the rise of the independent voter is really about something that is expressive of a growing distrust and a sense of non-identification with the parties, with traditional ideological categories and all of that. And I think that people are searching for ways to express themselves, including to describe themselves,
Mm-hmm.
that is non-compliant with the traditional categories. And so from where I sit, both as an organizer and as an analyst, I think it's incredibly meaningful that people choose to identify themselves as independents, regardless of how they may vote in any given cycle. I think it really is a very, very important and under-attended to phenomena that's going on in the country.
There clearly are more people who are registering as unaffiliated or independent in the country. And we have, you identified that a lot of times people don't vote independent because there's not an independent candidate. But
Right.
at the same time, how come more independents haven't been elected already? And what is it gonna take for that to break through?
Yeah. That's kind of a really complicated thing to unpackage, but I'll take a shot at it. And
We'll keep unpacking.
and we'll keep unpacking it. First of all, just the barriers to running as an independent are fairly, extreme. From ballot access to debates, to rules governing public financing and campaign finance programs when they are available. They're just kind of really unbelievably discriminatory relative to independent candidates. So right from the gate, there's just a huge disincentive for people who want to engage in public service and serve the public as an elected official and so on and so forth. It's just really a hard road for starters. Secondly, there is very much a culture in this country of being a two-party system. I think I had mentioned to you when we were talking recently that about 25 years ago there was a survey that was done in New York of high school students in New York City, which is a sophisticated cosmopolitan, center. And 60% of high school students believed that it was illegal to vote for a third-party candidate.
Yeah.
Not just undesirable, but it was against the law.
Unconstitutional.
Unconstitutional,
Yeah.
exactly. So you have, there's a whole belief structure, Then there's the issue of people feeling that to vote for an independent is a wasted vote because independents can't win because the Democrats and Republicans are so dominant. And that's kind of a little bit of a chicken and an egg kind of thing,
Yep.
right? And I was just looking back at some data from the Perot years and after the 1992 election, a poll was done that asked people if they believed that Perot could have won in November of 1992, would they have voted for him?
Mm-hmm.
And 40% of respondents said yes, which in a three-way race at that particular time would have meant that he would have won.
Mm-hmm.
So you have like a lot of those kinds of factors. But I also think, and maybe this is the most important for the purposes of where we are now as a movement and as a country, is that I think there's a growing support base now in the country because of the number of independents, because of the tremendous unhappiness with the parties and the party establishment. I mean, in 2016, the voter rebellion took place inside the two major parties.
Yep.
But that rebellion is a broad-based rebellion that crosses party lines and ideological lines. And I think that as that continues to emerge and take shape, I think that's going to fuel more independent candidacies and ultimately, and perhaps even in the not too distant future, and perhaps even in this state,
Mm-hmm.
some wins by some independent candidates.
Well, I've heard some arguments, even in our discussion group this semester,
Yeah.
that Bernie and Trump were really the first independents who were running, because they were running outside, they were trying to run outside of their
Yes.
party structures.
Yes.
And they did in a lot of ways.
Yes.
And this election was one of the more non-ideological elections. It was about something totally different, and maybe neither of the parties have caught on to that yet.
I think that's a really good point. I think they haven't for the most part. And, you know, the parties they're aware of the independent phenomena. But frankly, in my opinion, their view for the most part at the institutional level is that they don't really need to deal with it. Because I think they fundamentally believe that the tradition of being a two-party republic is so deeply ingrained in America that that will never change. And consequently, independents are always going to be a marginalized force, and you can go to them and appeal to them to vote for a particular candidate, but you never really have to engage the question of why so many people are independent and start to look at some possible systemic changes that would ease the distress that people have and
Right.
the distrust that people have about the way the political system is operating.
I've had dismissive journalists say to me,
Yeah.
the independent movement is the next big thing and always will be.
And
That we always talk this game of that, yep, this cycle it's going to happen, this cycle it's going to happen.
Yeah.
But I am seeing, and I know you're seeing, there are some signs that that truly is happening. And it's not just about the candidates, but it's at the state and local levels where some of these very influential reforms are starting to take hold.
Yes.
You would talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Well, first of all, when you're talking about a burgeoning constituency of independent voters, right away the issue that comes up is where and whether independent voters are allowed to participate in any given round of elections. And many states have closed primaries. And so the whole question of who do the primaries belong to? Is it a public primary or a party primary? What about the fact that taxpayers are funding these primaries, but in closed primary states, people who are paying taxes to support them, if they're independents, they're not allowed to partake of the thing that they are paying for.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so you have a taxation without representation kind of situation. You have issues like the redistricting question, where you essentially have the Democratic and Republican parties in the state legislatures drawing district lines in such a way as to benefit themselves, and largely they work out a power sharing arrangement between themselves, but not in a way that fosters competition. In a way it's done to limit competition. And so those are some of the, you know, the structural issues I think that are starting to move more into the public sphere. I mean, in the 2016 presidential election, for example, there were so many young people who wanted to vote for Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. And many of them had registered as independents in closed primary states, and they had no idea
Yeah, that they couldn't do it.
that they weren't going to be allowed to vote when
Right.
the primary season moved to their state. And suddenly, they're like showing up at the polls. I'm here
To vote
to
for
vote,
Bernie.
and the registrar says, oh, well, you can't vote. Well, why can't I vote? Well, because you're not a member of the party. But well, I'm an American. Doesn't that come with the package? Well, it turns out it doesn't.
Because they're private corporations that are in
Exactly,
charge of the
exactly.
elections.
But I think that in some ways, you see, sometimes people say to me, when you have an organization like I do, independent voting, and we work in 40 states around the country, and sometimes you're at these meetings in Washington, D.C. with these think tanks and whatever, and people say to you, well, how did you come up with the idea of open primaries or whatever? And I say to people, we didn't sit in a room and come up with the idea. It's like independents called us from all around the country and said, hey, I just tried to vote, but I couldn't vote.
Right.
And you get repetition on that over and over again, and you realize, well, here's a constituency. I think something that happens sometimes is people say, oh, well, people become independents because they just want to drop out of the system.
Right.
They're turned off by the system. And in one way, that's true. And the USA Today just came out with a new poll that showed 2/3 of Americans are they don't like the parties, and they're thinking of not voting. They
Right.
just don't want to participate in the system. But part of it is also that there is this growing pressure for wanting to change the culture of how politics works, but that's not just a mental thing.
Right.
That's actually, it's an engineering question.
Yeah.
It's a how do things actually work question. It's a cultural question, and how do you create that kind of change? And there's the institutional resistance to that is very, very strong.
Yeah, and how do you deconstruct some of these barriers that have been erected for decades,
Yes.
and very intentionally?
Yes, totally.
And
Yeah.
it goes to, in my mind, a lot of this, I'd like your reaction to this, is that what we're getting at is that we're trying to change people's opinions of what elections are for and who they're for. That the private political corporations that we think of as their parties,
Right.
they have gamed the system to where elections are about parties and the ability for parties to control who runs in them and who's going to win, and all these reforms that you've been talking about really flips it on its head and says elections ought to serve voters, not political parties. So is that something? Do you think that's catching on? Do you think that we're starting to get traction on that big kind of idea?
What you just described there, I think that is such a core issue, and in my experience, there's a lot of different ways that you have to come at this. So can I share a story that
Please.
is about this? Okay, so in 2008, in the presidential election, Barack Obama challenges Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination. Okay, independent voters, cutting across, interestingly, generational lines and ideological lines and so forth, are favoring Obama very strongly. And in the states that allow independents to vote in the presidential primaries, they came out in record numbers to support Obama. And in fact, Obama won the Democratic primary nomination. He beat Hillary Clinton in 2008 for the nomination, with his margin coming from independent voters. Okay, so part of what you see there is you say, oh, okay, now here's a picture of a new potential majoritarian coalition in the United States of America that crosses party boundaries, that is multi-ideological, that's multiracial, that includes a lot of younger people. Wow, look at this new thing that's emerging. Let's cultivate that. We go on to the general election. Obama wins independent voters over McCain, who himself had actually a long tradition of support from independents because he's kind of a renegade, and and so forth. And then he goes to Washington, and he's completely taken over by the Democratic Party. I mean, completely. So much so that he turns his campaign database over to the Democratic National Committee. I guarantee you that there were millions of people in that database who did not consider themselves Democrats. They did not consider the fact that they voted for Obama to equal that they had now signed on to be a Democrat. They actually were attempting to elect Obama as president to go to Washington as an independent. But as soon as he got there, for a variety of reasons, which are complicated, you probably have to do a whole other series on that, he capitulated on that and began to operate as if he were just simply an arm of the Democratic Party. And independents were very repelled by this and very concerned by this. And so you started to see some defections, if you will, from that coalition. Scott Brown wins in Massachusetts, right, as a Republican with independent support. And So at a certain point, coming into 2012, I go and I meet with David Axelrod, who was Obama's campaign manager. I say to him, David, there is a huge independent community out there. You've got to find a way to give them a signal that President Obama understands that they are independent and that he does not intend to relate to them as they're actually really Democrats because they voted for me the last time. They're independents for a reason. And let's talk about some things that the president could do to give a signal that the sun does not rise and set on the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And we spent 8 months in discussion with his top team about how to do this, how to create that. Should the president support reform of the Federal Election Commission, which is, the biggest, most important regulatory body for the election process in the country, right? It's made up of Democrats and Republicans. Well, how about we add some independents just because 40% of the country are independents today? A little nod to the fact that there's something else going on out there.
Yep.
So we had extensive discussions about this, memos going back and forth, how to frame that, and then in the summer of 2012, went out to Chicago to meet with the team, and they said, no go. The DNC stakeholders said to us, don't go there. We can win this election without it. We can win this simply by appealing to Democrats. And that's what we're going to do.
Yep.
And they did. And they were right in the sense that they won the election, of course. He was reelected. But they lost independence by 10 points.
Yep.
And in my opinion,
Ton of seats.
Yes, and a ton of seats. And they opened the door to what became the next major phenomena, which is the independent voter who had voted for Obama in 08 and 12, and then voted for Donald Trump in 2016. I personally hold the Democratic Party responsible for that shift because they simply refused to attend to this changing dynamic in American political life.
And they had the opportunity.
And they had the opportunity to do it. And it would have been like not a very big deal.
Right.
Not a very big deal. And it would have made all the difference in the world.
So do you think independent voters are going to be this shifting force and moving from right to left? Are they a pendulum? Are they a standalone thing? And the follow-on to that is there a coherence of leadership to an independent? If we elect a lot of independents, will there be an ideological string to it, or is it more about not belonging to something?
I think that here's what I think it could look like. Here's one paradigm or one direction it could go. I think independent candidates for a variety of offices will have a full range of positions on local and state issues, which will vary dramatically on ideological questions or policy questions, however you want to frame it. And I think they will be conjoined by a shared vision of systemic change required to open up the political process, to bring new voters into the process, to address the concerns that millennials have about the over-partisanization of politics, and be willing, frankly, to take some risks. If you open up a process, you can't control what's going to happen. And elections are not supposed to be, you're not supposed to know the outcome.
Yeah, before you have the
Before
election.
people vote. That's what a democracy is supposed to be. But politics has become this activity which is completely governed by outcome and outcome determinative behavior.
It's a kabuki dance.
Totally,
Yeah.
yes. And I think that independence, if I had my way, and fortunately I'm in a position of talking now to many different independent candidates who come from many different histories and many different policy orientations. But they do see this. They see this, the systemic stultification of the American political scene and are beginning to step forward. And that through line, that thematic, that process orientation that ties people together, these independents, that's going to be the key, I think.
And is it sustainable? So say we elect a number of independents.
Yeah.
Do they stay independent? Or do they try to shift things in different ways? Is there a coherent thing that binds independence once we're a force in politics?
I'd like to think the answer is yes, but I don't think it's going to be the traditional kinds of things that have bonded parties or ideologically oriented groups together.
Yeah, I think you're right. So what happens to the parties? Are we stuck in it's going to be a right-left two-party system, or will independents crack that open and there'll be independents and third parties and the two traditional parties? What's your take on that?
It's a little bit of a conundrum because people hate the parties right now. So if you go to people who hate the parties and say, well, let's have more parties, it's not altogether clear that that is a relevant thing. I think that the independent movement is pushing things in the direction, let's put it this way, of relocating or properly locating political parties. And there probably will be new parties that come into existence, and I think probably some of them will be competitive. I mean, I was coming out of the Perot experience, I was part of the circle of people who founded the National Reform Party, and we had a 7-year run as a cross-ideological, reform-oriented, upstart organization that drove the major parties crazy, and they were always trying to figure out how to crush us, co-opt us, corral us, and they finally figured it out. But that was our first try.
Right.
But I think, look, the parties, political parties are political organizations, presumably of like-minded people who want to pursue certain kinds of policy agendas, and they have every right and responsibility to associate and to participate in the political process in order to push that agenda. But they can't do that and simultaneously run the process in which they are competing for public support.
Right.
But that's what's happened.
Right.
Now. They are simultaneously the umpire and the player, and they have managed in some probably well-meaning ways, and frankly in other ways that are more nefarious, to conflate themselves with government.
Yes.
But they are not the government. They are political organizations. They deserve the protection of the First Amendment under our Constitution as private associations. This is part of the conundrum you get into around the primary question.
Yep.
Well, what is it? If you're a private organization holding a primary and you want to decide who can vote, fine. You just can't take taxpayer money to fund that activity.
Well, I was going to ask you about that because you've been very active in New Jersey in suing for this very thing. So you can talk about the New Jersey suit and what that is.
Yeah, in New Jersey, we tried with our good friends from California, the Pieces, Chad Peace and Steve Peace, we came up with this idea. This was kind of one of these things where you're kind of sitting around late at night, and you've already been working 30 years in the movement, and you're kind of like, gee, maybe there's like some magic bullet that you can use to kind of crack open this. Let's see if we can get the courts to do it for us, because it's a really long road. And so we came up with this concept for a federal lawsuit that raised, because of some particularities of the state of New Jersey's constitution that guaranteed all voters the right to vote in all rounds of voting. So we thought that was reasonable to interpret as meaning that you could vote in all rounds of voting. Turns out the court didn't agree with that.
Yeah.
And we also tried to raise the issue of the taxpayer funding question. And the courts turned us down.
So New Jersey had a closed primary.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so,
And 60% or something of New Jersey registrants are independents.
Which
by
is
the way. It's
which
huge.
is crazy. It just
Yes.
on its face is crazy.
Yes.
So 60% of New Jersey voters cannot choose who the parties put up, but then
Correct.
it's the party candidates are the one who are on
Correct.
the general election
You
ballot.
have to join the political organization in order to cast a vote. And this is, as you know, because we talked about this and we worked together on the New Jersey case, that principle that no American should be required to join a political organization as a condition of voting is a deeply held principle that goes to the foundation of what our republic is about. And I think that's being violated right now by the way the parties are being permitted to operate, and that needs to change.
And so what did the court say?
The court said goodbye. And we've also, we've litigated in slightly different terms. We've litigated in Idaho, which was an open primary state with nonpartisan registration. The Republican Party there went to court. It was actually kind of more, I would say, right-wing elements of the Republican Party wanted to change the state system to a closed primary system. They went to court to ask the court to compel the state to make the change. We opposed. They won. They introduced closed primaries, and now they're unhappy with it, and they're talking about changing it back. Same thing happened in South Carolina. We won in South Carolina. And so the case law is very divided right now, and so far, no case on these questions has gone all the way to the Supreme Court. But my guess is that probably in the next 5 to 6 years, I think some controversy in the courts will go up there.
It's coming. Mm-hmm. And to get to that fundamental question of, do you need to associate to...
Exactly.
And what are my rights as an individual
yes.
to have a full participatory vote
yes.
In elections,
yes.
not conditioned on ever joining one thing or another.
Exactly, yeah.
Really interesting. It'll be interesting, and I think the courts will do it. So all these things are happening out there. There are others that you're involved with, or at least keeping a close eye on, opening the debates, the presidential debates.
Yes, yes.
Now, why is that important? And maybe you can describe what the problem is. And
Up until 1987, the League of Women Voters was the sponsor of the televised presidential debates that took place in the fall, in which it has been, surveyed and documented that many, many voters watch those debates and make their decision based on what happens in those debates. So up until 1987, the League did it. And the League, of course, had a long history of being a nonpartisan organization. It was a women's organization, so it had a slightly less combative temperament relative to these kinds of things. And arguably they had done kind of a very competent job running this thing. But then the parties decided, the Democratic and Republican parties decided in 1987, they were done with the League. They wanted to run the debates. So they cleverly set up an organization called the Commission on Presidential Debates, which sounds like it's a governmental thing. Doesn't that sound like it's part of the government? But it's actually not part of the government.
Private corporation.
It's a private corporation that was given nonpartisan tax-exempt status, what we call 501c3 status, and they battled the League and they took over the debates. So now they're the Commission on Presidential Debates. So guess who the chair of the Commission on Presidential Debates is? They have co-chairs. One is the chair of the Democratic National Committee, and one is the chair of the Republican National Committee. So this is how the thing starts out. So it's really kind of a very egregious example of this, mission creep in which the parties cross over from being legitimate political organizations that are competing for public support and having to make their case with the voters to becoming the actual arbiters of what it is that voters get to hear and learn about and be educated about in making their choices.
And who gets to participate?
And who gets to participate, yes. So they promulgated rules that made it a very tightly held process. And so in 1988, I was involved with an independent presidential campaign of Dr. Lenora Fulani, who that year became the first woman and the first African American ever in US history to get on the presidential ballot in all 50 states. She was denied access to the debates. So we went to court and we started to litigate this issue. And we tried to litigate it every which way from Sunday. I mean, you name it. We had crackpot theories, we had good theories, it didn't matter.
Anything.
We did everything.
Yeah.
And we lost. We lost. Then came 1992, and Perot ran. And Perot actually was admitted to the debates, not because he met any criteria, because the criteria were completely subjective on the part of, but both parties must have thought that having him in the debate would help their candidate because they would take votes away from the other candidate. So they decided to put him in the debate. He goes in the debate. And that is the last time an independent presidential candidate was included in the debates. He was denied access in '96. Nader was denied access when he ran. And so there's been a whole chain of litigation trying to break this open. In the last couple of years, a gentleman by the name of Peter Ackerman, who I guess you first met Peter in Unity 08, is that right? Who is a wealthy entrepreneur who is a virulent critic of the two-party system, decided that he was going to put his money where his mouth is, and he was going to come up with a litigation strategy to challenge the Commission on Presidential Debates. So it's a highly technical road that he has pursued, but he actually has won some things along the way. Mm-hmm. And right now, where we are is that there's kind of a technicality in this area of law where in order to be able to sue the Commission on Presidential Debates for all of the violations that they incur, you have to do something called exhaust your administrative remedies through the Federal Election Commission. And so what he's asked the court for right now is the opportunity to sue the Commission on Presidential Debates directly. And he has a whole line of argumentation and research and so forth that he's done, which is very, very profound, which he's hoping to be able to pursue. And we're literally waiting. It could come, the decision could come down in the next month or so. Mm-hmm. And hopefully, if he gets this tiny little opening of a crack, then we'll go to work on what to do next.
And what would the result be?
The result could be an arrangement in which the criteria for admitting an independent to the presidential debates would be such that one independent would be guaranteed a slot. And exactly how you would choose that independent, there's lots of different stories or theories that are out there about how to do that. Maybe there'll be an all-independents primary. Yep. Maybe there'll be like a television show that's kind of like, the talent shows that they have on TV where you eliminate people every week.
Like Survivor,
Yeah, like a Survivor. No, exactly. We've talked about a million different things for this. But yeah, there would be some process, the end of which there would be a consensus candidate for the independents, and that candidate would be admitted to the presidential debates. I like this strategy, by the way, because even though it is controversial, frankly, but I like it because it is an incentive. It is a material incentive for all the independent players, the Independent Party, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, and non-party players, reformers, et cetera, to come together and create a process that brings everyone together. I'm very much in favor of that. I think that really enhances the power of the independent movement. And so hopefully we'll get there.
There's some others that are out there. Maine has ranked choice voting, which we had Kyle
Yes.
Bailey joined us a couple weeks ago
Right,
here
yeah,
to talk about ranked choice voting.
yeah.
And you've been a proponent of top two in other places,
Yes.
top two primary.
Yes.
Do you have a favorite, or do you have a new one? Is one better than another, or they're all beneficial?
I think they're all beneficial. I think they're all beneficial. And I would say that the litmus test, though, for each of them has to include whether they empower independent voters, whether independent voters are brought to the table through the implementation of any given reform.
Mm-hmm.
If it meets that benchmark, then I think it's all good.
If it's increasing competition and
Yes.
the power of the individual voter, then that's a good thing.
It's a good thing, yes. It's a very good thing. And we have to address it. I mean, how can we call ourselves a democracy, and how can we try to reinvigorate an electoral process which everyone is very concerned about, and not have a process that is entirely open to 44% of the American public? Not to mention that among younger voters, the independent alignment number is more like 71%,
Right.
because those younger voters, they don't bring that historical connection, whatever that might be, whether
Yep.
you were part of the Reagan Revolution, or whether you were part of the Civil Rights Movement, or whatever, that ties you to a particular party. They don't have that. And that's what they want to be, and they don't want to be in a party.
Right.
And I was, I think we talked about this, I was on a panel a couple of months ago in Kansas City as part of American Public Square, and Howard Dean and I were on the discussion together. And Howard, who of course is a Democrat, and he was the head of the DNC, and he ran for president in 2004. I was crushed by his own party. But Howard is sitting next to me on the table, and he's like, all of these young people are independents, and that's who they are, and they're not Democrats. And I'm like, well, I don't even really have to talk, because he's doing the thing for me. But the very, very last sentence of his thing, he says, but at the end of the day, they have no choice but to come to us
Yep.
and to vote for the
Right.
Democratic Party. And
Right.
I'm like, whoa, wait a second, how did we get there?
Yeah, you just told me that there was this violent move away from
Exactly.
one party, and then you're saying that they don't really have a choice.
Exactly. But it's creating those choices, it's creating the infrastructure that allows independents to fully participate, it's creating changes in the way the electoral process works so that independents are not discriminated against either at the candidate level or at the voter level. And then we'll have a contest about where people go. I
Right.
will have that contest with Howard Dean, but you've got to level the playing field.
Yeah. Now, I've asked this of other guests, and like your perspective on it. Do you think the parties are, as more and more people are independent, particularly young people are registering unaffiliated independent,
Yeah.
at some point there's this huge market share that's out there. Will one or both of the parties figure out, man, nobody's joining us anymore. I think we got to do something different.
Yes.
Or are they incapable of doing that?
Well, it's funny that it's a very pointed question. I just was earlier looking at, actually I was looking at a chapter in my book, Independence Rising, which traces the history of the movement and so forth. And I had gotten a copy of a study that was done by the Democratic Party after 1992, after the Perot experience, right? And they commissioned Stan Greenberg,
Mhm.
the pollster,
Yeah.
to do an analysis for them of how should the Democratic Party relate to the Perot voter. And so they did all these surveys and whatever, and so the DLC wrote a report, the Democratic Leadership Council wrote a report, and then the report they said, if you want to court the independent voter, you have to stand up for political reform. You have to do that. If you don't do that, and you think that these people are Democrats, you're never going to get them. And if you don't do that, if you don't find a way to ally with them as who they are, they're going to go off and form a third party, and that will be the death of us. This is literally like what the thing says. So, but nobody paid attention to that memo,
So we keep barreling along.
So they keep barreling along, but are there more enlightened elements, more sensitive elements, more aware voices in the two major parties on these questions? I think there are. I'm meeting them all over the country.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
And
think
it's
there
whether or
are.
not they wake up in time to it, and is it about being enlightened, or is it about being scared to death? You know, which part of it is more influential to one of the parties changing?
Well, that's kind of the essence of American pragmatism, isn't it?
It is. It is.
We're both enlightened and scared to death.
Exactly.
I think it's a combination of those things, but look at what happened even, after the Sanders campaign in the Democratic primary. There was, so much concern within the party about how to heal the wounds between the Sanders wing and the Clinton wing, particularly because they lost the election. They probably would have been a little less concerned if they had won the election, but they lost the election. And so they set up this thing called the Unity Reform Commission,
Yep.
an internal body, to work on some of these process issues. And the Sanders people kind of came in big guns, we're going to get the party to eliminate the superdelegate, and we're going to da-da-da-da-da, and we're going to open the primaries and so on and so forth. And then 6 months down the road, the process is over, and none of these changes have been made. And the thing has kind of settled back into the old way of doing things, So, I don't know. There's a lot of forces of inertia, a lot of forces of self-preservation, and there's many, many other things that are in play that pressure, I think, in the opposite direction.
Let me ask you one final question. And I've tried to do this with every guest, and there have been some students who have asked me to make sure we ask this.
Okay.
What's your advice to young people trying to break into politics and being involved in political things like independent voting? I know you have a lot of young people who are out there, out in the field, doing the hard work, and how did they get their jobs? What's your advice for how they can get those jobs? Well,
I would say there's two things about it. One is there's kind of the fairly time-worn and it works path of getting an internship where you get to associate yourself with an organization and you get some field experience. You're in a place where political people are there and you're talking politics and you're learning strategy and all of that kind of thing. And then that prepares you to go into the political marketplace and to get jobs and get positions and all of that. But the other thing I would say is that the extent to which the old political paradigm is based on maintaining a certain divide and a certain set of categories, right? For young people who want to become active politically and perhaps even have careers, political careers, if you can find ways to cross those ideological barriers, even in your own personal life and personal experience. We worked on a project with Arizona State University last year it was kind of a project on trying to analyze how social networks operate among Democrats, Republicans, and independents. So what they discovered, and this won't surprise you, is that people who are Democrats, their friends are mainly Democrats, and their news sources are mainly the news sources that are allied with the Democratic Party. People who are Republicans, same thing on the other side. People who are independents have friends who come from across the spectrum, and they actually read or watch news sources that are multifaceted in their approach. And so part of the findings coming out of ASU, and this was pretty electrifying, frankly, is that independents play a role not just in terms of how they might swing a particular election, but at a cultural level. They're the bridge builders.
Right.
They're the force that is not afraid to go out to dinner with someone who believes something different than you and actually try to have a conversation about that. So I think that young people, in my opinion, they have a feel for that. Like they have some combination of, they haven't been schooled yet into, not doing that.
Right.
Like the old song from South Pacific, you've got to be carefully taught to hate. They haven't been taught that completely yet. And so I think for young people who want to come into the political universe and be politically active, go find people who are not like you and go out for a cup of coffee with them and talk to them, and then write about that and blog about it and send, you know, an Instagram of it and that kind of thing, because that it will both promote that they have the capacity to do that, but it also does change the culture. When that's actually going on, it really does transform how the larger society operates. And so that is just so impactful, I think.
Great advice. Let's open it up to any questions for Jackie. Yes, sir.
Could you talk just a little bit more about the closed primary system?
Yeah.
What movement have you seen nationwide in state? I mean, how many states have been successful so far in opening up the primaries to the independents? And how much movement have you seen in the last, I don't know, 5 or 10 years? And especially, have you seen any movement here in the state of Kansas? And also, how do these independent candidates, all the way from president clear on down to county commissioner, how do they go about getting their names on the general ballot if they can't get on the primary?
Okay. All right. Well, those are great questions. All right. There are 2 states that have succeeded in opening their primaries in the last 10 years, I think. One is California, which voted to enact, the voters did this, voted to enact what's called the top 2 nonpartisan primary system. It's considered to be hugely successful, and it's being very closely studied by, you know, all kinds of academics and so on and so forth. But it's, in general, I think that the recognition is that it's put things on a very positive road. The other state is Washington State, which has also set up a top 2 system. Other states in the last 5 to 8 years have attempted to open a closed primary system. None of them have succeeded. And by the way, there are only 26 states in the country that permit citizen initiative. Consequently, given that at this point, there's no legislature controlled by Democrats and Republicans in the United States of America today that would open their primaries voluntarily, it can only be done, so far, through a citizen initiative process. So right off the bat, half the states are off the table. There have been campaigns in Oregon, in Arizona, and South Dakota, and in New York City, in attempts to bring about an open primary or a nonpartisan primary. None of them have succeeded at the ballot box. And let me just add, and this is, I think, I really appreciate your question because it helps to bring this out. Those numbers, those reforms, prior to Election Day, polled at anywhere between 57% and 65% yes. And on Election Day, they generally get between 31 and 35% of the vote, which I think is an indicator not that people were lying in the polls, but that the strength of the party organization machinery to poll vote is so far superior at this stage to the infrastructure and the vote polling capacity of reformers and independents, is that that's what comes out on Election Day. However, in the last year, the lose number has climbed from 32% to 45%. So it lost in South Dakota the last go-around with 45% of the vote. So it's inching its way up, and at some point, here, I'll make a prediction here. It's some combination of a wish and a prediction.
Yeah.
Okay. In 1990, the voters of Colorado put an initiative on the ballot for term limits. It passed with 61, 62% of the vote. That set off a wildfire across the nation where every state that had initiative and referendum put a term limits initiative on the ballot, and in every single one of those states, it passed by between 54 and 71% of the vote. Subsequently, it was declared unconstitutional because the states were setting the terms for federal office. And so it ran into trouble there, and all of that was erased. But it does suggest that you could hit a juncture where if one or two states put that over the top, that there's then a groundswell in that direction, similar to what we saw with the term limit situation, which interestingly, a difference is that the term limit thing, of course, is about limiting the terms of elected officials. Opening the primaries is about empowering an entire constituency of voters who are locked out. And I think that's a more developmental thing to do, you know? Anyway, so that's that. Now, what was the second part? I'm sorry. How about here in Kansas? All right, y'all have closed primaries. You have about 30% of your electorate are independents. You are not an INR state?
Correct.
Okay.
Tough.
You're in a tough position here. You're in a very tough position. I think, though, that something that I do think about Kansas is that I think, and I say this, I mean, I don't live here, and you all do, so I'm going to defer ultimately to your view on this. But from spending time here and talking with people like Jim and many other people who are active in a host of ways, I sense that there is a restlessness in the state. Things going on in the agricultural sector and in the ranching sector, and implications of the trade wars, and just a general sense that, wow, maybe we need to open some things up in a different way. I'm not saying that I think that that would necessarily lead to open primaries in the short term, but I do sense that there is a desire on the part of many people to try to shift things in terms of what the process is like and what the culture is like and what the power sharing is like and all of that.
And I'd just add to that it's big social movements take time, and they take a lot of effort, and it's like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill, that you push and you push and you push, and you never think you're going to get up the hill.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden, the rock falls over.
Yeah.
And big social movements in civil rights and in gay marriage and in marijuana laws, all these things that are happening across the country, everybody said there was no chance. That stuff was never going to happen, never going to pass in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And yet they do. And it's because of the sustained effort in states that do have INR that pass it, and then they show success, and the states that don't have it say, wait a minute, why don't we have that? And we're going to get voted out if we don't start latching on to these
absolutely.
things. So,
yes.
I do think these things happen, and it's difficult in a place like Kansas without the ability of citizen-driven initiatives. But I don't think it's impossible, and I do think citizen-driven uprisings that say we're going to start demanding these things from our legislature, they can take off, and they can take off really quickly once they catch fire. Thanks for the question. Any others? Yes.
So there's 2 states that have the open primaries.
That have what's
And
called
there's-
top 2 nonpartisan primaries.
Okay, and then there's 26 states that have citizen initiatives. Are any of those states in the process of trying to get an open primary?
Right at this moment, there's no initiative that's heading to the ballot in 2018 for open primaries. Let me just clarify, though. There are about 25 states that have nonpartisan voter registration, where you go to, when you register to vote, you don't declare for a party. And in those states, you can show up and vote in the primary. So they are considered open primary states, even though there are still party primaries that go on.
Or some are semi-closed.
Or semi-closed, yeah.
Semi-open.
Yes,
so
they have different requirements associated with them. So in about half the states, independents have some access. What California and Washington did was they abolished the party primary and set up a public primary. But relative to your question, in this cycle, there will be no state ballot initiatives for open primaries. There was an effort to get one on the ballot in South Dakota, which failed. There was an effort to try to mobilize support for one in Florida, which did not get across the finish line. But a lot percolating
Yep.
out there. Yeah.
And we just passed in Colorado 2 years ago, we passed the semi-open, so that now independents can participate in party primaries, but they can only, it's a convoluted rule, and they really did a job on us when
Yes.
what we passed was not what the legislature allowed it
Yeah.
to be ultimately,
Yeah.
which is classic for what happened.
Yes.
And it should be that anybody should be able to walk in, participate in whichever ballot they want to do. Colorado's a little weird because we've got an all mail-in ballot. There's no precincts. There's no going to the voting booths anymore. It's all by mail. So now you're mailed both ballots, and you choose which ballot you're gonna fill out.
Yeah.
And of course, they don't really explain it very well. So there's going to be a ton of people who fill out both sides of the thing, and
Yeah.
their vote
And then
will
they
be
forfeit their vote.
forfeited.
But one thing, though, to go to your question, is that there is an issue, though, which is an open issue, which is what is the position of the national parties going to be
Yeah.
in the presidential election in 2020. It has been established in the courts, and I have been involved in litigating this myself, that a party can choose to admit independent voters to their primaries, and that the state cannot intercede with that, cannot reject that, the Board of Elections cannot refuse to conduct that the party has the authority to do that. Consequently, in the 2020 presidential elections, both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party could decide that their position is that the presidential primaries and caucuses that they will be conducting as part of their nominating process will be open to independent voters. They have the authority to do that. And it doesn't go through the legislature, it doesn't go through the courts, it's just simply, it's a party designated issue.
Yeah, they're private companies.
Exactly, and they can
making
decide
private
that.
decisions.
So one of the things that we're doing now around the country is building a grassroots campaign to pressure the parties to take that position. And as we go into 2019, in the year that's kind of the run-up to the presidential, post the midterms, and the sorting out process after that, we're going to be making a very big push to put that demand on the national parties. So far, they've tried to dodge the issue. They've
Yep.
tried to kick it to the states. They, they dance around it. But they could do that with the stroke of a pen. They could do it.
There was a question over here.
Yeah, I tend to ask the very simplistic questions. As far as an open primary versus the top two primary,
Yeah.
so if I'm an independent voter, and I get the top two, I'll be given, these people are voting and I'll vote.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody will get the same ballot, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But open primary, if I'm an independent, I come in and I say I want a Republican or I want a Democrat.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, what if I'm a primary candidate in like Kansas? Nobody can vote for me then in the primaries, is that correct?
Correct.
Right, you have to disqualify directly to the general ballot by signatures, by collecting enough signatures, or paying, in some states, just pay a fee and you're on the ballot
Oh, okay.
as an
okay.
independent.
But you're saying in federal elections that the Republican or Democrat parties can say, you can vote in our primary?
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. They could. They haven't. But they could.
Oh, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I guess if I'm a candidate, I don't really care as a voter if you're independent, Democrat, or Republican. So I guess my question, I'm a candidate,
Yeah,
I want to know how do I appeal to an independent voter?
yes.
And I guess, but one concern I have with that is, okay, I can get elected. I mean, like Trump got elected, and he's an idiot. But once you get in office, and you got to manage it. So, I mean, I assume you got to work with Democrats and you got to work with Republicans to
Yeah.
get things passed. So I'm kind of confused with if it's really good to be an independent candidate. But I guess my real question is, if I'm an independent candidate, what do I have to do? Or no, if I'm a candidate, period, what do I have to do to appeal to the independent voter at this point in time, do you think?
Yeah,
Great question.
it is. I think you have to address the fact that so many people are independent. You have to literally tell people, I get it. I get it. I get why you're an independent. I get why you want some systemic changes in the way the process works, and I'm going to support them. I'm going to support those things, even though if you're running as like a Democrat or Republican, you know, my party might be mad at me for doing that. But I'm going to do that because I think that's what's best for having a healthy democracy and having the consent of the governed. I mean, part of what we're dealing with right now is that we have a government, but we don't have the consent of the governed. We have a very, very fractured electorate. We have a very polarized Congress. And the consent of the governed, which is a foundational contract, right, between the American people and the government, is so profoundly eroded right now. So that's what I would advise people, and I do advise people to do. And you know, when we were in the early 2000s, I worked with Mike Bloomberg when he was running for mayor of New York, and he ran both as a Republican and as an independent. And New York has something called fusion, where a candidate can run on more than one party line, and the voter chooses which line to cast their vote on. And I ran Mike's independent campaigns. And at one point in the process, the beginning of his re-election campaign for his second term, he commissioned a survey that was kind of more like a census than just a survey. It was like a really deep dive in which he arranged for a survey that surveyed 80,000 independents in New York City. 80,000. A huge number. Larger than your usual polling sample, right? Right, okay. And one of the things that was explored in this survey was whether independents felt that if they knew that a particular candidate was supporting things like nonpartisan primaries, nonpartisan redistricting, you know, nonpartisan election administration, same-day voter registration, some of these kinds of things, if they knew that, would that make them more likely to want to support that candidate? And the numbers came back like through the roof, like was 78, 80% or something like that. And that was the first time that anybody had done, if you want to call it a scientific survey, on the question of how independents link the importance of being in support of structural reform issues with a decision that they make at the voting booth. And it was pretty emphatic, I would say, you know.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So then how does a candidate for president, an independent candidate for president, get on the ballot? And does he have to do something different in all 50 states? Or once he's on the ballot, is he on the ballot everywhere? And same thing like a governor. How does a governor get on? And what does he have to do? And is that different in each state?
Yes, it's different in each state. And at the presidential level, I mean, the question you asked reveals something that's very, very dramatically unfair about the political process. So in 1988, when I was working on the independent presidential campaign of Lenora Fulani, as we were talking about earlier, an African-American developmental psychologist who wanted to run as an independent, primarily to go to the African-American community and try to offer the opportunity to be something other than a Democrat, okay? That year, in 1988, the Democrat had to collect 50,000 signatures nationwide. to get on the ballot. The Republican had to collect 50,000 signatures to get on the ballot nationwide. Lenora had to collect 1 million signatures to get on the ballot, just to appear on the ballot. So that discrepancy, and those laws are promulgated state by state, and they are made by, guess who? The Democratic and Republican-controlled state legislatures, who are just, in a way, they're just trying to eliminate the competition that they face. It's not even, I don't even want to ascribe some big conspiratorial whatever to it. It's, they just don't want to have to compete in those ways. So those laws are very, very biased and very, very discriminatory. And then for governor, you know, the rules vary from state to state. In some states, it's not that difficult to access the ballot for governor, right?
For here, yeah.
For here, it's
very
not terribly arduous, but you know, in some states, it's pretty significant.
Yeah, it does vary, and having gone through a couple of these with Unity 08 and Americans Elect, where we actually went out and tried to get ballot access in all 50 states for a to-be-named later candidate, it was just an unbelievable hurdle to crawl over. It was millions of dollars, not just a couple $1 million, multi-millions of dollars
No,
to
it was
go
huge.
put these efforts together to get, and to do it right, because as Jackie said, every state is different. Every state had these intricate little laws of when you could file and who could collect the signatures and how many proportionally per congressional district did you have to get, and how many were validated. And so if you needed 75,000 signatures in Louisiana, you really had to get about 150, because half of them were going to be thrown out. And if you looked at it and said, well, right now it's $4 to $5 per signature for paid circulators, and you total that up around the country, you're talking millions of dollars to do these things.
Yeah.
Where does that money go?
It all goes to getting, lawyers make a lot of money on it, petition signatures. The firms that go out and collect all these signatures make a ton of money. But it's crazy. Even before you've started campaigning, you've had to raise $20 million just to get on the ballot. I mean, Bloomberg started down this path of doing it when he was thinking about running, and I think they allocated, I don't know how many millions of dollars to lawyers and petitioners to go out there and canvass and collect signatures. It's just crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great question. Any others? None? Well, thank you, Jackie. Thank you very much for making the trip out here.
Thank you for inviting me. It was really fun. Thank you, guys.
And thanks again to Student Advisory Board. Thank you guys for your help this semester. And thanks everybody for coming out. Appreciate it. We'll see you the next time.
All right then. Well, could have done like another 4 hours right there.
Okay, so if you're running as independent, you have to get more signatures.
Yes.
If you're running as an independent or a not Republican, not Democrat, if you're libertarian,
It depends.
It depends.
Really?
The laws vary whether you're trying to get on as an independent party, like the Libertarians, or whether you're just trying to get on as what's called a solo independent.
And it could be that if the Libertarian Party is recognized as an official party of the state, if it has established that it could be a minor party or a major party. If it's a major party, then you get
a lot of
it's a lot of hoops jumping through.
I voted for 2 independents. I voted for John Anderson and also for
You did.
Oh, did you?
Yeah.
Okay. Excellent.
I did too. My very first one was Anderson.
Yeah, in 1980.
Yeah, first time I could vote.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, so you're kind of like hardcore.
I guess, yeah, because I voted for Perot too, but it's like you said, it's not something that's been in my consciousness.
Right.
I have been registered as a Republican and a Democrat,
Right.
but I have voted. When it comes down to it, I have truly, put my money where my mouth is. Anderson, Perot, Perot signed my yard, ruckus,
Oh, did it? Oh, good for you.
I lived in the middle of Kansas, which is very conservative,
conservative.
and I stuck this sign in my yard, you know.
Yeah.
Because, yeah, that must have felt good. It was interesting.
Did you vote for Pro in 92 or 96?
92. Yeah, 97.
Moved on by now.
Yeah, I just learned how to get it. Who knows where my mind was then. Yeah, but.
And then perhaps they could have done a little planning before they decided to do this.
Nice meeting you.
Yeah,
Thank you for
likewise.
that.
Oh, is that right?
Again, all right, thanks.
Hey, thank you.
Hi there.
Might be interesting, that project I'm trying to do.
What's that?
It's a crowdsourcing.
Okay.
Where I talk a lot of people, yes too, you just aren't happy to vote these way. They don't make sense. We want you.